Okay, I'll pass over to Vicky Donnelly then, who's facilitating our workshop today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a million, Nancy and Sian and Jerry-Ann and Kate and everybody. I know people have worked really hard to make this course happen, so it's actually exciting and lovely to be here. I was going to, start pretty conventionally. I was going to ask people would they mind introducing themselves, but just as a really preliminary question, I would be really just delighted to know have we met before? have we done a workshop together before? Maybe would you let me know if you can remember, because it's tricky sometimes with the online stuff. I know if we'd met face to face, it would be much easier to remember. But has anyone done a workshop with me before? Can you remember?
No, not me.
Not you, Cheryl. We're new to each other. Kate, we have before for sure. But otherwise, Julia or Casey, Linda,
No, I don't think I have.
We're meeting for the first time. Okay, that's
I don't think I have.
my
first time.
Amongst my many anxieties that I bring to the table, because it's such an amazing group. Of course, I'm sort of thinking, it's only a small bit intimidating to be amongst you, because I know the work that you've been doing is amazing. But also, I just wanted to check that I wasn't going to repeat some things maybe that we might have done together before. Well, much simpler introductions then, please. I would love to know who you are, where you are, what you're teaching, and would you also, because you've been working together for a while, if there was a kind of, the way they talk about my most significant learning, so not putting it in big capital letters like that, but what has particularly stood out for you, or what has been the loudest bell that's rung for you, or what's been the most significant thing for you so far, if you don't mind. And maybe would I just call on people so that you've got the feeling of dread hanging over you all the time. Casey, how about yourself?
I'm Casey. I'm working in Gorey. I'm a science teacher, but I'm teaching climate action to first years as well. I think any of the bits that kind of tie into climate justice and the more kind of global parts of it have been standout for me that I didn't really think of before. Sorry, I've got COVID at the moment, so I've got no voice.
Oh, goodness. Oh, get well soon. So the climate justice elements have been really important for you. Thanks a million, Casey. How about yourself, Aisling?
Hi, Aisling. It's okay. I'm in Cork Educate Together, along with Cheryl, Julia, and Jerry-Ann. So I suppose for me, the standout is kind of like the climate justice, but also the action part for them, like having to go and like before in the past, if you did something on climate action, you're just designing a poster or you were making a presentation, whilst this seems a lot more active and kind of more productive what they're actually doing, and kind of stuff that they can take away with them after school. So that's kind of what stood out to me most.
It really is like a learning for life, and in many different meanings. Thanks a million, Aston. Cheryl, how about yourself?
So as Aisling said, I'm working with Jerry-Ann, Julia and herself in Cork Educate Together. I'm a science teacher and I'm teaching the sustainability course at the moment, so to second and third years, but with a view in the future that I may be teaching climate action. The takeaway for me has kind of been, I suppose, that idea of solidarity versus charity. Again, that kind of social movement element of it, as opposed to it just being about, well, what I'd focus on, the science and, what's happening and things like that. So that's kind of been my main takeaway from it.
Magic. Thanks a million. Hi, Susanna. How are you? Would you like to tell us who you are and where you are?
Hi. Sorry, I'm late. I was just finishing to supervise the break. Okay, so I'm a student teacher and I'm completing my work placement in the Cork Educate Together secondary school. And I teach geography and CSP, and I hope to teach short courses on sustainability and climate action in the future.
Fantastic. And has there been anything that has stood out for you, particularly over the workshop so far?
Okay, unfortunately, I wasn't part of the workshop. I was invited to participate in this one, so I can't say anything about the previous, but I'm sure they were brilliant. Because I met you before, I participated to the workshop where you were present, so I'm sure they were brilliant.
Thank you. Thanks a million. Julia, how are you? Good morning, or good afternoon even.
Hi, yes, I'm in Cork educated together as well with Cheryl and Ashton. Sorry, my camera's just off at the moment. I'm just in the car, but I'll have my camera on in a while. Yeah, I think I'm teaching climate action to first years. I think like I've always believed in the social movement side of things, so I feel I was always kind of aware of that and believed in it. But I feel the course has kind of helped me get some like more practical tools and skills to actually be able to like facilitate you know, like educating the students on how to actually do that. I always believed in it, but the actual gathering and organization of it would have been challenging, I think, for me. And now I think the course has helped me kind of get some real like tangible stuff on how to actually get that underway with them. So yeah, that was for me.
Fantastic. Thanks a million, Julia. Linda, good afternoon. How are you?
I think Linda just put in the chat that she has COVID and has put an introduction. She's put her introduction into the chat.
Apologies, Linda. I didn't spot that. Thanks a million. Teaching from a geography background, first year climate action. Brilliant. I'm sorry that you're home with COVID. It sounds. Hope you all feel better soon. Adon, how are you?
Hi, yeah, it's Aideen.
Aideen, apologies.
I'm a science teacher in St. Oliver's Community College in Drogheda, and I guess the big take home for me is that, yeah, teaching science and teaching climate action are really not the same thing, and I'm still feeling very much out of my depth with the course, making up things as I go along. I'm not sure if I'm making up the right things, but I think, yeah, I'm trying to convince management that this is not necessarily a course for science teachers and that we need to get some other teachers involved as well, I think.
Great. That sounds like a good move. Thanks a million, Nadine. Kate, good afternoon. How are you?
Hi. I'm good. I am teaching in North Wicklow Educate Together in Bray and teaching climate action to the first years. And a significant learning experience. I'm finding it hard. I've been really trying to think. I think in general, the workshops and like hearing the experiences of the other teachers for me has been really helpful. And that's something that would stand out for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Jerry-Ann, I know, is traveling, so I don't know if there's access to a mic, or because I don't want to put anyone at risk if they're driving, having to be distracted. So maybe we'll just say welcome, Jerry-Ann, and we'll hear from you later when you arrive. Yourselves, Shannon and Nancy, would you like to say anything that has been most significant for you so far?
Yeah, I could actually. It's been like a learning process and many teething problems getting this project off the ground. But the process of beginning to, like, actually, even though we've only been able to connect online, over the course of these workshops, like getting to know each other better, and like Kate said, hearing what the experiences have been like for teachers in the classroom, and then slowly translating that into concrete actions that myself and Nancy can do to support, and like starting to develop more resources. It finally feels like we're moving up a gear, and that's been really nice. So yeah.
Yeah, myself, I think hearing the on the ground, the real like classroom scenarios that people have and the different types of groups is really good to kind of situate the course in all sorts of different schools. So I think having all those experiences from the teachers really help us be very realistic about how the course can go forward. So I love that we have quite a mix of schools, and obviously we hope to grow that. So I think that's super valuable because it's, you know, it's a pretty ambitious course, but we have to make it like more accessible every time because it's got to be for everyone. So I'm really happy with all the experiences we're getting from the teachers. Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to talk about my own background. I suppose I come from a background of what's known variously as development education, global education, education for global citizenship, global justice education. There's kind of so many different nuances to it. I studied a bit of education for sustainable development, and so people love nothing more than to sit down and talk about the differences in nuance between these things. And I won't do any of that today. I don't think that's of interest to us. But I suppose thinking about the approach that all of them have in common, I suppose, is that it's and why climate justice fits so squarely in here, I think, is that it's an approach that differs maybe from the usual lens that we take when we're looking at development issues. That, I mean, if I was to ask, how each of us first became aware of global development issues, it tends to be through the lens of charity. That tends to be our first kind of encounter for most of us. So I don't know if that's true for people here, but when I ask the question, it tends to be people talking about even being like 5 or 6 years old at school, and collection boxes and fundraising appeals and shoe boxes. And so our primary lens tends to be that one of charity, I suppose, when we're looking at global development issues broadly. And where this approach differs, I suppose, is in terms of thinking about solidarity as a more, as the key frame. And I know that was just mentioned there in our introductions, and so that's why I'm confident to ask you a question straight up, even just before we do anything else. I think we could define charity really, really easily, but if we were trying to think of what solidarity means to us, would you be willing to put something into the chat, or by all means use your mic? But what does so nobody has to come up with a dictionary definition, but maybe between a lot of us we could make a tapestry of meaning for what solidarity means for us. So we've got this sense of standing with others, listening to what people have to say, to their experiences, and working together, having a common goal, standing with all stakeholders. It's more togetherness, having a common cause, being united, working together. Actions involve people directly affected by a social issue, with rather than for. Really lovely. So this, I guess, sort of sets a very particular kind of approach. So we mentioned justice, not charity, solidarity rather than charity, and a focus on root causes. So it's not to dismiss the desire to help each other at all. In fact, that's to be fostered, that reaching out to each other, that sort of sense of solidarity implies that sense of mutual support. But maybe under quite different kind of a set of relationships than we would ordinarily kind of assume, maybe in approaching development issues. So I think maybe just to get us started, actually, I've been trying to decide whether or not to do, which activities to do first. But I think it would be, if people are in a position to go into small groups, I was going to share as a methodology that explores some of these things sort of in a little bit more depth, and also a methodology that I use in the classroom a lot. So it's one that we could look at as a kind of frame, try it out for ourselves, and think how you might adapt it as well, more for the purposes of a climate theme. So I was going to ask, maybe in groups of 3 or no more than 4. In a moment, I'll just explain how we'll do it first. That we'll have, I think it's 9 questions. So it's a quiz basically, and in small groups you can look at these questions and just give them your best guess, essentially. That's all that's being asked. So some of the questions might be immediately obvious to you, some of them might be more of a puzzle, but all you're being asked in any case is just to give your best guess. And not because there's, you know, hey, there's no wrong answers. You'll get the quiz in the form of in a PowerPoint, so it's coming in here now into the chat, and if you just click on that before you go into the groups, hopefully somebody within your group will be able to open it and share it in the breakout room so that you'll be able to see the questions together. And if there's somebody on a phone who can't see it, you can read them out to them so that everyone can have their best guess. So you'll be zipping through it pretty quickly. You'll just take make sure everyone has a chance to give their best guess, or maybe and then when you get to the end, when you get to the last question, you can just keep scrolling through the slides and you get the answers. So you can sort of look at those together and we'll come back. So we'll be looking at about a 20-minute activity. If it's taking longer, don't worry, we can check in and see, nobody will be rushed to sort of complete it as a task. Just you can work your way through it. So if that's okay to open some breakout rooms, and if people want to just click on that link before you go in, and like I say, my hope is that everyone will have somebody in the group who can open it onto the screen so that you have those questions. But we'll hop in and have a quick look to make sure that's working out for people. So enjoy. Welcome back. How are you doing? I don't know if everyone had a chance to get to the end of checking through your answers. Great, Jerry-Ann, Sorry, what was that, Fiona? Yep, brilliant. Alrighty. So what I was just going to ask was just your thoughts or your feedback if we're thinking about this session around building solidarity movements. So this quiz is one that I use for loads of different purposes, I suppose, but for our conversation today around building solidarity movements, was there anything that stood out for you, or any connections that jumped out at you? And I don't know, in the first group, I can't see the breakout room breakdown anymore, but so anyone at all, if you want to come in.
I found it weird that Switzerland and the vote, like, it's not even a country we considered. Like, it didn't come up even in naming countries that begin with S, and yet it was one that was, we kind of all went, whoa, at that. It was kind of shocking. And the other thing was the COVID vaccination rate in low countries. Like, we had it as less than 20, but that it's that low, 25 compared to 39 million, like, that is huge imbalance. I think they were the two kind of main ones, well, certainly for me anyway, that I kind of was a bit shocked at.
Yeah, that would have been in the early months of the vaccine rollout. All right, it was one where I had to go back and check a podcast or replay of the news to make, did I understand that? It wasn't 25 million. So that sense of, so your shock around Switzerland and the inequalities around distribution of a very key resource. Thanks a million, Cheryl. Anybody else? Anything that jumped out about you for you around these ideas of solidarity? Or
I think we're most surprised by the representation of women in Parliament. Like, not that we expected Ireland to be exceptionally high, but we kind of ruled it out as soon as we saw the other three countries, and we're kind of debating which one of them would have the lowest, and just assumed we had the most women.
Yes, that one stings people quite often. I've noticed. It sort of gets quite a reaction.
Yeah, I got angry nearly. I was like disgusted. Yeah, and it was just the three countries in particular are all ones that from my school days I remember as being war-torn and famine-ridden, and, all examples that we would have been learning about in school, right? The troker boxes back in my day were all Ethiopia, and Rwanda and Iraq. Like, I have knowledge of reading about those countries and being in difficulty. We should be helping them. and yet they've more women in power than we do. I was disgusted.
Okay. And does that raise a sort of a question for us then, or something to consider about solidarity? And your descriptions of solidarity were so beautiful. Like, I think I'm on board immediately. I want to join that movement. I mean, it really sounds deep and long lasting, and like this is how change could happen, working in this kind of way. Do you think that sometimes our efforts at solidarity can be hampered maybe by underlying assumptions, by dominant beliefs, and what are, if that's so, what are those beliefs, or what are those assumptions? Is there something in those first two questions maybe that highlight something for us?
I'm not sure if I'm going to exactly answer your question, but I was thinking about the representation of women, and I was thinking that it could be quite a good hook for students who maybe don't think globally yet, but they start to think about injustices, and especially, not especially, but maybe female students who feel the injustice of it, and it might be a good hook to kind of get them thinking. And the connection between Ireland and kind of women's rights and gender equality, and then looking at areas of the global south and on other topics to do with gender equality. But it also makes me think of, you're asking about assumptions, like we have an assumption that we do things really well, that Ireland is progressive and is all these things. But then when you look at that stat, it's also about saying, what can we do in our own country to improve these areas of inequality? Yeah, it's my penny's worth.
Oh, thanks, Kate. No, it's really, really interesting. And those questions, for some reason, always remind me of a tutor of mine from years and years and years ago, Ashok Ori. He made it was actually just a throwaway statement. I don't think it was meant to be something that we all scribbled down and, noted or anything. It was just, putting his stuff away at the end of a session. He said something about, well, of course, it's virtually impossible to learn from somebody if you feel superior to them. Virtually impossible to learn from someone if you feel superior to them. And so for some reason that like hit me like a cast iron frying pan to the head. I think, it's going, whether our efforts at solidarity and the vision that we have there of how solidarity relationships could look, is it worth exploring kind of dominant notions or assumptions that not necessarily are, connect with our own personal values or our own beliefs, but nevertheless are so dominant in the society that they might influence how we see each other, how we see ourselves, and how we relate to each other. And what do we lose then, if that dominant idea kind of just stays in the ether unchallenged? So I guess that's part of maybe one of the questions that the quiz possibly raises. In terms of building movements as well, and as educators, those two questions about food and water. I don't know if anybody sort of was struck by them. Do you think, do they say anything to you about the kind of the approach or the underlying beliefs or the foundations of a movement that can support us? I know they're two of the grimmest questions for some people. They just.
Regarding the one about the water, my family is originally from Sicily, and unfortunately the public suppliers had to deal with a local mafia, so the maintenance of the pipes is not made properly, and my family had to buy water in bottles for generations.
Yeah,
and we had a story of few activists who've been killed by mafia because they reported these. They were students, people working at the radio. So I wasn't that surprised about the water, to be honest.
Yeah.
And that's Europe. It's not even a developing, well, the bottom of Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. One of
it
the
is
most
not considered, we're not considered a developing country in Italy, but some areas are still developing.
Yeah, and that I think is such an interesting point, Susanna, about who is considered developed and who isn't. and the implications of that, and even what development should look like. You know, who gets to decide how development should be defined, what our ambitions or our aims should be in any community. I suppose one of the things about those questions and thinking about it from the position of education and working with young people, that grim as they are, I suppose that's part of it, that this approach doesn't try to shy away from reality. It confronts reality, and I guess we have to, whether we're looking at global poverty, whether we're looking at food, water, climate. It's really counterproductive, I think, to shy away from the realities of these issues. But admittedly, I am a little bit addicted to optimism, so maybe this is me scraping the optimism barrel at this stage, but I do see something kind of positive or constructive around those questions as well. I don't know if anybody shares any sense of positivity or optimism around them.
Definitely, because they're kind of showing that the kind of one of the other dominant ideas that change is impossible and that inequality is inevitable. Like, if some dominant ideas are incorrect, then maybe other dominant ideas are also incorrect. And, you know, if all of that food is available and being wasted, then, like, it's not a question of it being possible. It's definitely possible. It's just how we organize ourselves and how we distribute power. So I think, yeah, they are weirdly simultaneously depressing and hopeful.
Yeah. I think particularly when working with young people, that message is so important, so important, that it's not necessarily about a lack of resources. Now, that's not to reinforce some notion that there's an endless supply of, you know, we are on a finite planet, but that currently the level of inequality we see is unnecessary, and is the result of, is political. So the message, I suppose, that inequalities, climate injustice, that these are political issues. Like if we were doing a workshop on gender this morning, I don't know why I keep calling it morning. If we were doing a workshop on gender this afternoon, and I tried to convince you that, you know, up until the 70s and, you know, even into the 90s, women in Switzerland didn't have the vote because there was a shortage of votes. There was like not enough votes to go around, and like, too bad. But eventually men kind of, share, they donated votes across to the women. You just be, like exactly how you're looking at me now. It's like, I think your analysis is a bit off there, Vicky. I think that was clearly a political problem and it required a political solution. So it's about reminding ourselves, I suppose, and in our approach, that all of the other issues that we're looking at as part of that quiz and as part of this course are just as political. And I know that, we define solidarity, which is a hard concept already, and I won't ask you all to define what does that mean, that something is political, but I often lean on Harold Laswell's definition there of, that if it's political, it means that we're looking at who gets what, when and how. We're looking at that kind of the power to make those decisions. And then crucially, I suppose, how do we change that, or how do we have an effect on that? So any other thoughts about the quiz or anything just that jumped out at you? There is one question that was in there that maybe it's just worth a little mention, that just relates to that maybe the first point that we made about solidarity and underlying assumptions. I guess I just need to quickly ask another question, I suppose, in relation to it, and that would be, what other meanings does Timbuktu have? Because I would have been nervous, to be quite honest, answering this question for most of my life. I think I would have been afraid of making a fool of myself, because I wouldn't have been 100% confident that Timbuktu was a real place. I think I might have suspected that.
That's what I said. I have a memory of it being like in a story or a nursery rhyme or something. I never thought it was real growing up. I always thought it was something about Timbuktu there was some story or rhyme from when we were little kids, that it was a really far away made up place. I didn't, I can't remember why, but that's just what I had in my head. I had to look up and go, where is Timbuktu? You know.
Oh, absolutely. And I wondered, was it a generational thing? But asking like children in schools, in primary and secondary schools, it still seems to have very similar associations. So yeah, somewhere very far away, so far away that it might even be made up. I don't know if you have any other ideas from your own families or kids. I actually love these. I collect them pretty much. Like kids have told me that lost thing, if something gets lost in their house, you know, must be in Timbuktu. If their family members don't want them to know where they are, where they're going, like mind your own business, I'm going to Timbuktu. And lots of stories about children saying if they misbehave, they'll be banished, they'll be sent away to Timbuktu. A lot of kids would say that they get threatened with it, with banishment. But in terms of just thinking about this quiz as a critical thinking activity, I suppose, and about those solidarity relationships, I guess it's just drawing our attention to that as well, about how come a place that just a few hundred years ago was a world centre of learning, with the most valuable traded items were books, and not just religious texts, but books on science and astronomy and medicine and poetry and books written by women. How come it would have been transformed in our popular imaginations into the back of beyond in just a few hundred years, really? So, and he thought, what else was going on during that time, I suppose, that might make it more useful from a certain point of view to think of Timbuktu and places like it as the back of beyond rather than a world centre of learning, if we think over the last few hundred years. So I don't know, I have no way of knowing for sure, but I guess colonialism, imperialism, slavery, exhaust extraction, just exploitation generally may have played a role here in creating narratives that kind of excuse or legitimize that kind of exploitation. And as so that our movements, I guess, if we are building solidarity movements, arguably need to have a really explicit anti-racism focus or anti-racism sort of commitment built into them, if we're to sort of try to avoid falling into some of those assumptions. And given that the climate couldn't be more relevant, I suppose, to the issue that we're talking about today, given the impact of it globally, and the impact of colonialism and extractive relationships that have those kind of historical roots. And I know you did some work with Megan on economic justice and how those extractive relationships and exploitative relationships, were reconfigured, I suppose, so that they haven't necessarily gone away, but they've been reconstellated to create this kind of picture of global inequality that is often summarized, I suppose, in this little ratio. I don't know if anybody fancies unmiking and translating that into words for us, if we were using this ratio to talk about global inequality. More for geography teachers, maybe, or I suppose a snapshot of, that gets condensed, I suppose, into this little notion that 80% of the world's population is only getting access to 20% of the resources, and trying to get by and not always getting by on far less than their fair share. And I suppose the flip side of that, relating to 20% of the world's people consuming way more than their fair share. So this is kind of the sort of very common kind of little snapshot, but I think the world is probably considerably more unequal than that. If we were talking about wealth alone, we'd probably be looking more at a kind of 6:94 kind of ratio, but it's been tidied up, I guess, for people like me who find numbers very hard to remember. So would anyone else like to just raise anything else from the quiz that stands out for you, or that you'd like to?
There's two comments in the chat that I missed as well. So Casey had said, I think it's great for people who consider themselves to be good people, in inverted commas, or people who actively try to not have prejudice. It shows that we do have assumptions, and think it would be great for showing students that there's always room for us to improve. Reason why solidarity is needed. And then Jerry Ann had said, colonialism, building empires may be easier if you think the place you want to dominate is remote or peripheral.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for those. And I'm sorry I didn't see the chat. When I'm sharing screen, I tend not to be able to see those messages coming through, but they're so absolutely so relevant, so bang on, that sort of sense of distancing. And then I suppose when we're looking at an issue like climate that connects us so directly to each other, that those distancing mechanisms are even more important to dismantle. I think we can't afford to see ourselves in those kind of separate silos anymore. So I just, I'm sort of, there's loads I would really like to talk about actually, but in terms of sort of building movements, and I'm trying to think as well about activities or ways that we can kind of also have these discussions with students. So I guess I'm trying to cover things in both ways. Yeah, in terms of time, maybe I'll sort of talk about a couple of activities and some of the ideas behind them. Like if we won't have time to go through all of them, but one of the ways maybe of continuing with this conversation about notions of development, assumptions about development, is to explore the language we use first and foremost to describe just in everyday language. And I'm not, I just think for the purposes of our very short time together and the fact that you're all busy, I won't try dragging everything out of you. I'll just talk more than I ordinarily would, just in recognition that we're not in a regular kind of workshop, I guess. But just that everyday language that that is used, that's very familiar of notions of developing and developed countries, or that spectrum actually that can continue to underdeveloped, or even notions of undeveloped countries. People will sometimes talk about like no development ever happened here, that sort of idea. And Pat Kenny's favourite, just rich poor countries. That it can be worth spending some time about what kind of images or assumptions are attached to them. So even just sometimes groups draw it, but in any case, to sort of try to mine our mind's eye, not necessarily in terms of our beliefs or our values, but what are the dominant sort of associations and some assumptions. So that if somebody's describing to us, maybe they say, "Oh, I lived in a developing country for 3 years," and they're talking about that. What kind of images and associations are coming to mind? If we can see people, what are they wearing? What kind of work are they doing, or how are they spending their time? How are they getting around? What does transport look like? What does the land look like? If there's buildings, what can we see? So that kind of imagery that is popping up. And similarly, to sort of be curious about the associations when we hear about somebody talking about the so-called developed world or the so-called first world. So to spending time on those and maybe drawing out questions about how, where those images come from and what kind of values and assumptions lie behind them. And historically, do we have any idea of like when did we start using language like this? So, what is it rooted in, or what kind of context does it come from? And does it affect, and this is a question I'd love to ask us, I know we're not doing the activity, but if anyone has any thoughts on just, do these kind of terms, do you think they affect social relations? Or to put that much better, do you think it affects the relationship between me and you if I say that I am developed and you're developing, I'm rich and you're poor? Does that establish something between us? And if so, what do you think?
I think by telling someone that they're developing and we're developed, it kind of makes it sound like the issue's on them and that we've got everything sorted, we're superior, and that they have problems that has nothing to do with us. I think.
Well, so much in that. They have problems and we have solutions to their problems. I think like that you put me back in mind of the quiz, I suppose, like with the gender questions, like other people's problems are so easy, aren't they? We all know what our friends should do about their relationships, their children, everything. It's so easy when it's somebody else's situation, or we imagine it to be somebody else's situation.
I'm not saying that that's the way we should be. I'm saying
totally,
what the words are implying.
Yes, absolutely. No,
Just to be
totally
clear.
understand that. Yeah. So that's I think you captured that really well. In terms of the historic origins of them, I think it's kind of it's worth getting into sort of, so like first world, third world. I don't know if people have any thoughts on where that comes from. And this is not an activity, by the way. It's a critical thinking activity, like the quiz. It's not telling people what language they should use. Susanna, fire away. It'd be lovely to hear you.
I suppose the questions that come in my mind is who's naming developed and developing, and who's developing the developing country, and what cost has for the developing country.
Hugely. So
and I'm relating to the existence of the IMF and WTO and the World Bank and the structural adjustment plans specifically.
Absolutely, hugely. This structural adjustment plans that killed 500,000 children a year in the name of development. So absolutely, it's quite a deadly agenda. So exploring that kind of language hopefully is a way to maybe draw out questions like that and some of those assumptions, and not to impose a kind of vocabulary or language. Aideen, would you like to feel free, please come in?
I just wanted to ask, is there anywhere we could get more information on this? Because as a science teacher, I have no background in any of this. Those phrases you're mentioning there, structural, means nothing to me. I'd love to learn more. So that I'd love to have this slide up in front of my students and be able to actually answer questions that they'd ask of me, because I really don't know any of it. I have no idea of the origins of these terms or who is developing the developed and all that. So is there any reading you could maybe point us towards?
Yeah, the slides will, and when you get them, the slides will hopefully serve as a notebook as well. So we'll have ideas there of developed and developing, and something of the history of those terms.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So some people, for example, the notions of first world and third world, and talking about that with students, they would have associations. Well, third is kind of like third rate, or like the winner's podium in the Olympics. It's the bronze medal. It's so that there can be those kind of associations. So it can be interesting just to kind of look at the history of where that came from, and the idea, initially at least, of a third world country being, having a very different kind of connotation, and going through that story of the Cold War, that it comes out of that context, and the Cold War, of course, not being a conventional war as we tend to think of them, more a war over models of economic development in many ways. And so drawing that out from the students about, well, who were the two big players in the Cold War, and what were the models of economic development that they were each promoting. So, we have the first way, that system that we know and love as capitalism, being promoted by, and I would be I would, if we had more time, ask you to fill in all these gaps. But, the US promoting capitalism, and the former USSR promoting what we know and love as communism. And so the second way, because even asking that question, if we have a first world and a third world, does that make you curious about anything? And it's a really lovely moment in the classroom where there's the kid is going, hang on, what about a second world? And where was that, or what was that about? So the second world, or the second way, being communism. And so the third world was, we had all these newly independent countries around that time, and even asking that question, why would you have a load of countries suddenly becoming independent? And, usually we have to think our way through this, going, yeah, why? Like when I was in primary school, I really recall my teacher, I loved history, and we had this substitute teacher in for history for a little while, and she was really young and funky and wonderful. And of course I just loved her, and I loved history. So I was that keen child, But I really remember to this day, the phrase that she used. She said, those countries were granted their independence. And I was like, oh, just odd. So I was a 12-year-old girl, The word granted for me was associated with fairies, stereotypically, the idea that, that's who grants things, So I had this weird notion of a fairy going around like, and you shall be free, and you shall be free, and you shall be independent. And there you go, the wave of a wand. And what a contrast that was with our history books that were open in front of us on the table, which was all about the struggle for independence, the fight, the courage. No, there was no line in it that just said, and then Ireland was granted its independence, end of story. So these countries were, having fought as courageously, as bravely as that, they were in no hurry to yield up that hard-won independence to a power struggle between two superpowers, the first way and the second way. So to be a third world country was to say, we will find a third way, we'll make our own path, and we are the third world. So not even so much a geographical space as the sense of a political movement. So we're starting to think about change and movements. A third world movement, I think, is something that's worth having a little bit of attention on, and how their thoughts at the time about how to recover from colonialism, how to recover from those generations and generations of asset stripping, divide and rule, and everything that went with that. So just going into that language, I think, can draw out a lot from us. Interestingly, developing seems to have the same historical context. Cold War, US President Truman speaking about the, in his inaugural speech, talking about the underdeveloped world, and really establishing this idea of a linear, single-track model of development, and incidentally, we're at the end of it. We are the destination point, developed, full stop, and the rest of the world is on that track. And the assumption that they're trying to reach us, or trying to reach this point. So very, very tied to wealth markers. So that's conventionally how we measure development in this kind of narrow term, and all the problems that go with that. Is the higher the GDP, the higher your level of development, but also the consumption and pollution and waste and everything that goes with that gets hidden inside those numbers. So some people reject language like first world, third world, because it has connotations maybe of hierarchy. Other people embrace it because of its political origins. Some people prefer language of developed and developing. They find it more kind of politically correct. Others totally reject it because of this sense of patronizing ideas of the rest of the world kind of trying to reach some sort of predetermined endpoint. Regardless, I suppose there's another difficulty with this, assumptions that lie behind the language here, which would be that, I suppose, if that same fairy went around that granted independence, according to my history teacher, what if tomorrow morning all 7.9 billion of us were living developed lives, right? So we all did arrive. If that was people's choice, if that was, if that was how it went, the question there would be, I suppose, how many planets would we need to sustain that level of consumption? If we take 80-20 as a rough measure, with 20% of the world's population consuming 80% of the resources, how many planets would we need for all of us to fulfill that model of development? And I don't know if you're busy doing the sums. I'm really bad at maths. But if the answer is more than one planet, I tend not to bother with the hard work of actually doing the maths, because I reckon it's probably easier to rethink our model of development than to go and seek more planets than we actually have. So that's, if you wanted to explore that question, I think really sensitive to the fact that parts of the world have become overdeveloped, which is a term we don't use, at the expense of others, and with a climate justice kind of lens on that. But sort of thinking about our model of development is, as a really important part of that conversation. Another activity borrows from a Brazilian economist called Marcus Arruda, who came to Ireland at the end of the 90s at the invitation of some brilliant radical women's community groups in Kilbarrack in Dublin. So Marcus Arruda was invited to speak to them about models of development, which was really prescient if you think of the whole Celtic tiger that was just kicking off at the time, and what a pity the doll didn't invite him at the same time. But he proposed a kind of thought experiment to help us when we're having these discussions, to help us think through a very common misunderstanding, I suppose he posed it as, between growth and development. That when these issues are discussed, growth and development are often used synonymously, as if they're interchangeable terms, as if they kind of mean the same thing, basically. And he reckoned this was very dangerous. So he had a kind of a thought experiment to help us just kind of illustrate that or think it through. So for the purposes of this very short version of that thought experiment, could we pretend that we're a family for a couple of minutes, please? Are you okay this afternoon, that we can be a family? Okay, and then just again, quickly, we need to, if we're going through it quickly, we have a new pet. So our family has a new pet, and so Cheryl, you get to decide whether we have a kitten or a puppy. This family of ours.
We'll go with puppy.
We have a new puppy and we're delighted. And Casey, would you like to name our puppy? The only thing I'll suggest is don't name it anything you're too attached to, but at the same time, you know, we love the puppy, so we want to give it a nice name.
The only name coming into my head is Stephen.
Stephen, and we love Stephen. Stephen is just doty, so we want to take care of Stephen. We want to make sure that Stephen is well looked after. We're a responsible family that way. Susanna, what would we do to take care of Stephen? What's the first thing we need to do?
Feed him good food.
Absolutely, we need food to keep Stephen healthy, and so we feed Stephen and he grows. How wonderful! And we feed him and he grows. Fantastic. And we feed him and he grows. Wow, we didn't expect him to get this big. And we feed him and he grows and he keeps growing and he keeps growing and he keeps growing. Like, we really had no idea. And Stephen is literally growing so much that he could easily burst out through the roof of our house and still show no signs of stopping, like way beyond anything we've ever seen or imagined. So what Marcus Aruda, I guess, is suggesting is that after some time, dear family, we might need to have a difficult conversation about Stephen, because what we might have on our hands here is not so much a pet as a monster, much as we love him. There is a real problem with anything that perpetually grows, will need to be perpetually fed. So this was his not too subtle, I suppose, metaphor for thinking about the difference between development and growth. If we have a model of development that is based on endless growth, we are going to run into like really, really serious limits very quickly. And we all know that that's already happening. So development, if we're trying to think through what development is for ourselves, that can be, that depends on how we design it, how our vision for it, and how we follow through on it. Whereas any model of development that's based on eternal, endless growth, which is the one we have, is going to bring us very quickly into conflict with the very earth under our feet. So I know this is not news to anyone studying climate, but in terms of thinking about that model of development, having opportunities to consider that for ourselves, I suppose. And there's more notes there, by the way, on development and how we measure it, and is higher GDP better for our well-being, and the kind of language we use. So there's more there if it's of any use. But time to sort of think through what development might mean to ourselves is a brilliant starting point, I think, with students to think about their own values and what would the world look like if our values and our beliefs and our desire for the world that we want was how we could define development rather than simply endless growth. So there's just instructions there on a ranking activity. It's sort of, so there's two versions of it. You can download it, or you can I can give you Jamboard links if you want to do it online, if that's useful. But it encourages students, I suppose, to start thinking about their own model of development and how that often contrasts with what we have. And my experience has been that students always choose a world based on on equality and on fairness and on justice, with environmental, sort of protection of the environment really central to it. They do not go for the endless growth, the high salaries kind of swish version, I suppose, of the world. So it's a way of kind of grounding that. So I'd like to just really briefly talk about narratives of change and then a couple of case studies, if that's okay. I'm sorry that this is so talky and less doey, but I hope there's some ideas for doing. So I guess as educators approaching this theme, this is one of the things we're trying to challenge, this dominant narrative, which you can probably see on the thumbnail. There's a clue about what this stands for. But you might all be too young to remember what TINA stands for or where it comes from. It stands for there is no alternative, and it was a catchphrase of this person that she said it so often. It sort of got its own little acronym. So when we hear people talking about TINA politics, this is what they're referring to. So that when we're told over and over and over again that there is no alternative, well, we can speculate about what the outcome is. So in secondary schools, I sometimes, as part of the discussion, I'll just recall that as a teenager in the 80s, the stereotype of us back then, when I was a teenager, was that we were desperately idealistic. We wanted to save whales and forests and, bunny rabbits in laboratories. We wanted to save everything. We just very idealistic, and that when we grew up, we'd realize it was all so much more complex and so on and so on. But that was how teenagers were seen. And asking teenagers today if that is still the case is quite a poignant moment, because, well, if you want to feel free, if you want to mute, how do you think teenagers imagine they are seen today? Or what do you think the stereotype is of them today?
There's a stereotype that they're like addicted to their screens and a bit lazy.
Yeah, addicted to screens, obsessed with image. Or at least this is what they share when they ask, kind of generation selfie. And then you've asked them if that's true. They're very clear that it's not. And some of the most inspirational movements around climate have been led by young people in Ireland and internationally. So challenging that, I suppose, is acknowledging that having that mantra being repeated over and over and over again, that there is no alternative, has an effect, and reclaiming a space to imagine radically different ways of being is a really important part of education. I think we don't have to have the vision of how it should look. That's actually a collective project that we should establish that together. But even making space to imagine, to question and imagine is hugely important. So, and the question about how change is made and the stories that we're told about how change takes place. Sorry for skimming very quickly here. And exploring that in the classroom. So I often put this picture up and ask people to tell me who it is. So I'm asking you, does anybody recognize the woman in the picture?
Rosa Parks.
There she is. There's dear Rosa Parks. And what is the story around Rosa Parks? Why is she famous? Why do we recognize her?
Because during the Jim Crow laws, the seats were segregated on the buses, and she refused. She sat where people were supposed to sit, and she refused to leave her seat when someone asked her, and then she got arrested, and then we had several demonstrations after, and support.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And that story is such an inspiration, I suppose, and so kind of iconic. And when we're discussing it in classrooms, it's really interesting to draw out what children have been taught or young people have been taught. And I don't know if anyone has kind of experience of this on the framing of this story. I think it's not just this story, but this one's kind of interesting to look at. So in primary schools, you'll sometimes find titles, books about her in the school library, but with titles like the tired, that focus on her as an individual, that focus on her really a kind of almost kind of whimsical decision one day, that focus on like, that she was very tired that day coming home from work, and she didn't give up her seat to a white passenger, and therefore the civil rights movement. So looking at how change is portrayed is really helpful as well, and how we get told stories of exceptional individuals or accidental heroes like Rosa Parks. So you have your Nelson Mandelas, or you have your Rosa Parks, stories that leave out really important details. So they kind of suggest maybe that it's a simple cause and effect, that success in campaign terms comes very quickly or directly, and encouraging young people to think about what's left out of those accounts and why those kind of accounts are so popular. So one Black woman didn't stand, and then how this kind of creates a whole movement. So Rodolfo Walsh, Argentinian revolutionary and writer, he sees this as very deliberate, that that this is something that's done quite deliberately, where every new generation gets told the story of change, but with the most important parts left out. So it kind of gets depoliticized, and each generation then has to relearn those lessons, has to sort of figure them out again. And as he said, history becomes just another kind of private property then, and those who own it own everything else. So as well as we're going to do quickly, look at some case studies of at learning from change makers and how people have struggled, and the lessons from their successes and their failures. But I think there's huge learning in looking at narratives around change as well, and how what gets left out and what we can learn from what gets left out. That there was not just one single Rosa. There were other women who that this was a very strategic action, that Rosa Parks was kind of selected basically because, and we could question their from a distance, we could question that movement's selection process, but she was seen as very respectable, unlike Claudette Colvin, who was a single mother, a teenager. She thought that she would play well in the media, but it was by no means like some random act. Rosa Parks, even her choice of husband was based on politics. She was profoundly political, and that movement, and as you were pointing out, Susanna, was involved protests, huge protests, very long running protests, 381 days of boycott, huge organizational feats of lifts that had to be organized when people weren't taking the buses as a boycott, the fundraising around it, legal challenges. So ensuring that we don't fall into this idea of exceptional individuals, which we can see very clearly in the climate movement. Greta Thunberg is the climate movement. On her own, Greta Thunberg is a pretty, sad-looking teenager outside the Swedish Parliament. That recognizing that it's the movement, it's the collective action is the only thing that has ever been really effective. And rather than looking to exceptional individuals, as other civil rights activists have said, recognizing that it is people just like us who have done this in the past, and we can therefore do it again. So I was going to briefly share a couple of case studies, but just want to pause because I've been talking non-stop. So is there anything anyone would like to come in with, or any points you'd like to raise? Or thanks, Jerry Ann, you had there is no alternative there, and links to the wider Montgomery bus boycott story there. So this, I guess, is our first case study, I suppose, to look at, just deconstruct how did they create those kind of changes in that context. So there was obviously a lot of organizing that does not make it into the mainstream narrative. If we wanted to take 5 minutes in breakout rooms now, I'm going to share another, maybe just 2 breakout rooms, please. would be brilliant, and there will be a set of slides around around some social movements. So there's a list of them, and there's some that I use in schools. But we could, if you wanted to just look at two of them, you could look at the Kenyan Greenbelt movement if you're in Group 1, and you could look at MASI, the movement of asylum seekers, if you're in Group 2, and just have a quick read together and come back with one or two sort of things that you think that we could learn from those movements to help our learning. Sorry, I'm just trying to do two things at once, which doesn't work for me at the moment. My multitasking is on strike, I think. So again, it's a PowerPoint again. So if we have groups, and we'll just take 5 minutes if you want to go in, if somebody could open up the slides as you did last time. And if you're in Group 1, have a look at the Kenyan Greenbelt movement. If you're in Group 2, have a look at MASI, the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, and just come back with, in terms of tactics or how the groups work, how they achieve, change in their contexts. Could we take a couple of broad lessons from them, please? Welcome back, folks. I'm sorry that was very, very short, but it would be lovely to hear any, if we're sort of thinking about movements and what we can learn from each other, from our successes and our works in progress. I don't like to say failures, but any lessons that came out from the group who you were looking at the Kenyan Greenbelt movement, and would anybody be willing to put it in a sentence of what that movement was and is about?
I can try. So community development based tree planting with a goal of 1 billion trees, and it's spread over a very large number of countries now. So it's spread, and it involves people in their local area planting income generating trees. So it's supporting their own livelihoods and also becoming stewards of nature. And it seems to be very successful in spreading, and presumably has some sort of democratic basis, because it's community development based rather than kind of like top down organizing. And it does have an individual person that's kind of like credited with the whole thing, but it clearly can't be all them.
Yeah.
They've had a lot of, they've gone through a lot of targeting and kind of a lot of challenges, kind of opposition to their work. And the network seems to also, like, local groups seem to resist other things as well, not just planting trees, but also resisting developments that could impact their own areas.
Thanks a million, Jerry-Ann. And again, as a taster of what, anything that inspired you, or any lessons that you think were useful or important from that movement?
Just that it ties into people's economic needs, I think, for me.
Yeah, that it's not divorced, it's not asking people to be sort of solely altruistic or solely, operating in as if they're divorced from the realities of their lives. But it recognizes the people's everyday lives, their real lives, their everyday needs, and builds on those. So that's a huge part of climate justice. I suppose a huge lesson for anybody or any movement engaged that way. How about the group that looked at MASI, the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland?
Yeah, I can talk about MASI.
Thanks, Fiona.
No problem. I suppose, it was just a very interesting movement. It was about a group of people coming together. They didn't have any kind of set membership, but a group of people with an interest in ending direct provision. There were some really interesting points about how we got messages across about the conditions in direct provision. Like it was through like art and photography, and so there were some really interesting ideas in there on how actually they raised awareness of the issues of direct provision. We just said it's great to have a look at these different case studies so that we can actually share them with our students. That it really does generate the discussions and ideas for students to start thinking about something they might be interested in, doing or working on. Thanks.
No, thanks a million, Fiona. There's brilliant timekeeping as well. The slides that are there, if they're of any use, they have sort of notes for students at the beginning. So the idea was actually not to provide too much information, but that groups could take them as it was sort of the beginning of a project, and think through some of the things that we were talking about. Is it based on justice, not charity, and is it a solidarity campaign? Is it a campaign that gives us an example of people self-organising, working as collectives, not, as you were saying, Gerianne, a focus on a hero individual solely? So there's a few guiding questions, and then there's a few examples of different campaigns. In the version I have for schools, actually, it includes Fridays for Future and Student Climate Action Network. So there's ideas about them as well, so students can think about what other students are doing. So they're really varied. Some of them are historic, they're in different kind of contexts, but maybe as a way of starting a conversation about what we can learn from each other. If we're thinking about radical campaigns, and how we build on that. And with my fantastic timekeeping, I know it's kind of like screeching to a halt rather than coming to a beautiful conclusion. If it was possible, if we still had 90 seconds, would it be okay for each person to leave with one word? Would you leave one word, either something that struck you or how you're feeling is also fine. Just so the last voice you didn't hear was mine. Casey, would you have a single word for us to finish up with? I know it's not the end for the project, but for me to say goodbye and hear one word.
Collaboration.
Pardon?
Collaboration.
Thanks a million. Aisling, how about yourself? Do you have one word?
Hopeful.
Thank you so much. Aidan, have you got I've mispronounced your name again. Aideen, excuse me. Aideen.
Sorry, no, I'm reading all the stuff in the PowerPoint.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sitting here. I wasn't paying attention. Sorry, I'm just reading about US troops in Shannon at the moment.
Fair play to you.
Learning lots.
Clearly. Claire, how about yourself? Have you a word to send us off with?
Eye-opening.
Thanks a million. Susanna, love to hear a word from you.
Yeah, hopeful.
Thank you very much. Cheryl, how about yourself?
Collective.
Lovely, thank you. Kate, have you a word?
Muddled, like just needing to do more research.
Thanks, Kate. Gerianne?
Maybe refreshed is the wrong word, but something like that, like reinforced. Like, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Fiona, did we get a word from you yet?
No, I am inspired to kind of share some of the ideas with my students.
Brilliant. If any of that was useful, please, I'll send it on and feel free to take it. There's a climate quiz as well, but it's not that critical. It's more facty, so it's not. I didn't think there was any point in in doing it this afternoon. Big thanks for having me. Oh yes, Earth Democracy. Thanks for the book recommendation, Susanna. And Reinvigorate, it's Nancy. Thank you. I was cheating you and Shan of your words because I've gone over to 3:31 now already. My word is grateful, really profoundly grateful. And thanks so much for the time and the conversation and the insights. Really
Thanks to
appreciate
you,
it.
Vicky. It was
Thank
brilliant.
you.
Really great. And
Best
we'll
of luck.
share the slides and recordings with everybody afterwards.
Yes, the slides I will try. They were in very weird order, so I'll try to tidy them before I pass them on to you. But
Yeah, and the resources that folks put in the chat, because I know Jerry Ann mentioned another one from Mighty Times about a children's march. So we'll stick them in the email.
oh yeah, lovely example.
Great.
Lovely. Yes.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Have a great afternoon.
You
Bye
too.
bye.
Thank you. And we'll hopefully have a
everybody.
second part to Vicky's workshops in autumn.
Thank you.
Long
Thanks a
folks.
million. We'll talk to
Bye,
you soon.
everyone.
Thanks so much.
Take it easy.
Bye.